Saturday morning in Moscow. People are lining up for coffee, the outdoor cafes are starting to fill up, and traffic is moving slowly, just like any other weekend. Some go for a run along the river, while others head to the market to buy bread. It's business as usual in the capital. But suddenly, that calm is shattered. Huge explosions, smoke everywhere. Gunfire, drones flying over the rooftops, and Russian soldiers standing right in the middle of the street, man-pads slung over their shoulders, firing into the sky in the heart of the Russian capital. VisualPolitik community, this is no longer a scene from the front lines. This is Moscow, and this is the new reality. Day in and day out, the Ukrainians are striking critical infrastructure across the country. Refineries, export terminals, fuel depots, drone factories, and countless other targets. And no, we're not talking about minor damage, quite the opposite. Take, for example, what's happening with the refineries, which have borne the brunt of the attacks. According to information gathered by Reuters, at least 25% of Russia's refining capacity is currently compromised. And take note, because that figure keeps rising week after week, and the effects are already starting to be felt.
Russia faces spreading fuel shortages after Ukrainian drones pummel refineries. Lines at gas stations are a growing headache for the Kremlin's efforts to shield its citizens from the consequences of the four-year-old war.
Virtually all Russian regions are already experiencing shortages. And remember which country we're talking about. A country that is one of the world's 3 largest producers of black gold, and one that depends on oil to fund a large part of its public budget. How is all this possible? Well, basically, because the Ukrainians have managed to get ahead in the innovation cycle, which has given them unprecedented air superiority, an advantage that has only just begun. Everything points to the fact that we'll continue to see images like these for many months to come. And it's not just us saying this, Russian military bloggers themselves are saying it, as they now admit that this Ukrainian superiority could last at least another year. This is something, by the way, that we've already analyzed and discussed in this video you see on the screen. And once you watch it, you'll realize just how dire the Russians' situation is. For the first time in a long time, they've started losing more territory than they are gaining. They're suffering more casualties than they're recruiting. A war economy that's been severely strained, and a population that's fed up. Add it all up, and the result is that Putin is increasingly cornered. So much so that he might be starting to look toward the negotiating table. And this isn't just our assumption, it's Putin himself who has begun sending signals.
Russia is ready for peace talks with Ukraine, based on the agreements reached in Istanbul, on the modalities discussed in Anchorage, and most importantly, on the realities on the ground.
And yes, it's true that these words might be emptier than they seem. After all, Putin has been making demands for years that are so outrageous that Kyiv will never accept them. So on their own, these statements don't prove much, and even less so when, as the Russian president himself acknowledges, they are based on old negotiations that went nowhere at the time. Of course, keep in mind that they aren't the only indication, and there is one additional sign in particular that suggests this time things might be serious. Just a few weeks ago, the Russian media outlet Dosi leaked an explosive document, a PowerPoint presentation allegedly prepared by the inner circle of Sergei Kirienko, former prime minister, deputy head of the presidential administration, and one of the Kremlin's major heavyweights. And what was this presentation about? Well, it was about how to sell a future peace agreement to the Russian public by passing it off as a great victory. Think about what that means. In the upper echelons of the Kremlin, they're already beginning to see the end of the war as a possibility, or perhaps as inevitable. In fact, the PowerPoint presentation itself states this explicitly. In it, Russia's territorial ambitions appear scaled back. Gone are the days of wanting to keep half of Ukraine. Now the talk is of retaining Donetsk and Luhansk, and the areas they control in Kherson and Zaporizhia. In other words, essentially freezing the front line in those areas. And take note, they're even considering withdrawing troops from Sumy and Kharkiv. In other words, for the first time, Russia appears to be preparing to make concessions. And let's be honest, they're not exactly a big deal, because for the most part, they simply follow what's already been established. But even so, the shift in stance is highly significant. So why this change? Precisely because of everything we've been telling you so far. They sum it up themselves in one sentence that says it all.
You have to know when to stop. A war at all costs is a sure defeat. Pressing ahead with the special operation will lead us to a Pyrrhic victory.
What's more, the plan is already laying the groundwork at home. The document outlines tailored messages for each group that might rebel. The most radical ultranationalists, employees of the military-industrial complex, veterans, a separate message for each group. So in short, the war might be closer to ending than ever before. But wait a minute, be careful not to claim victory too soon. Quite a few sources warn that, despite everything, Putin and certain circles around him remain deeply determined to continue the war. They don't want to end it unless it's in exchange for a full-scale Ukrainian capitulation. But obviously, the situation is what it is, and continuing the war could jeopardize Putin's very survival. So in this video, we're going to shed some light on all of this by answering a few questions. First, could this situation really push Putin to the negotiating table? Second, what would each side be seeking? And third, to what extent might the concessions we've just seen be enough to end the war? Well, let's take a look. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, well, I've got some good news for you. At Visual Factory, we have created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain, in a clear and simple way, the most essential investment concepts. What multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better. Since we send each episode of the series by email and every edition is unique, if you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get into the video. Could Putin really continue to stubbornly persist with the war? Well, as surprising as it may sound, the answer is yes. Here's the thing. Things aren't going well for him on the front lines. That's true. But for now, there's no sign of a military debacle in the short term. Domestically, there are no alarming cracks within the power structure either. In other words, the regime, for now, is holding together. And as for the economy, well, it's more of the same. It's true that 2026 has gotten off to a particularly bad start. Even the official figures acknowledge a 0.2% drop in GDP in the first quarter. But be careful, because that could be more of a one-off blip than an underlying trend. Take a look.
In January, Russia raised the VAT from 20% to 22%. And what did people do? They brought all their purchases forward to the end of 2025 to avoid the increase. The result? A skyrocketing final quarter and a first quarter that hit rock bottom.
Add to this the fact that the start of this year had fewer workdays and a particularly harsh winter, even by Russian standards, and the downturn is almost entirely explained. In fact, according to The Economist, the coming quarters will improve to the point that they estimate the Russian economy will grow by around 1% this year. That said, let's not get the wrong idea. This doesn't mean things are going well. For starters, the economy is largely holding its own thanks to massive military spending, accounting for between 7 and 8% of GDP. Inflation is starting to spiral out of control, and private investment in the non-military sector is going from bad to worse. So the economic strain is already starting to show. But of course, it's one thing to feel the strain and quite another to collapse. The latter is much more difficult and is probably nowhere near happening. What's more, not everyone is suffering from this strain equally, far from it. And the ones who feel it the least are precisely those tied to the war machine, arms manufacturers, soldiers, and regions that depend on military spending. The Kremlin continues to pay them well, because they are its top priority. So as long as the money keeps flowing to those who sustain the war can continue. For how long? Quite a while. actually, because the public finances, while not exactly cause for celebration, aren't in shambles either, and Putin still has a few levers at his disposal to make the numbers add up. If he needs money, he can raise taxes, as he has already begun to do. He can draw on the remaining reserve funds, and he can take on debt, which is exactly what he's doing as well. And although his debt keeps growing, it's still starting from an extremely low level. It doesn't even reach 20% of GDP. That said, there's one important caveat. Taking on debt with sanctions in place isn't exactly easy either. With the doors to Western markets closed, Russia is forced to borrow almost exclusively within its own country, which significantly narrows its options. But even so, options remain. And if things got really bad, it could always tap into the savings of businesses and citizens. After all, who's going to stop it? So, as much as it pains us, Putin still has plenty of ammunition left. If he wants to, the war could drag on for quite some time. And make no mistake, if negotiations ever take place, that's exactly the card he'll play. Of course, that leeway isn't going to come cheap, not by a long shot, because it's one thing that there aren't any cracks yet, and the economy hasn't collapsed, and quite another that all of this comes for free. Putin can keep pushing, yes, but the more he pushes, the more likely it is that those cracks, the real ones, the important ones, the ones he faces not only with the economy but also with politics, will begin to emerge. And this is no secret. We know it, his advisors know it, and he himself knows it. And that's precisely why, sooner or later, he's going to have to sit down at the negotiating table. But of course, it's one thing to sit down to negotiate, and quite another to reach an agreement. Because for this war to truly end, it's not enough for Putin to want to talk. Much more is needed. So the question is, are the conditions really in place for all of this to end once and for all? Well, to answer that, we first need to take a step back and really understand what each side wants. But before we dive into the quagmire of negotiations, I'm just going to ask you one quick thing. If you found this video interesting and want us to keep making videos like this, then subscribe and hit that like button. And yes, most of you are already subscribed, but just as many of you aren't. It only takes a second for you, but it helps us a lot to keep creating content like this. Anyway, with that said, let's get down to business. During these 4 years of war, there have been several rounds of negotiations. Istanbul, Switzerland, the United Arab Emirates, and they've all hit the same wall. Because what one side demands is exactly what the other cannot concede. So let's lay our cards on the table. Let's start with Russia. The first and most important issue for Moscow is territory. It demands recognition of Crimea, which it occupied in 2014, as its own, as well as the 4 regions it annexed in 2022: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. But the list doesn't end there. Russia wants an end to sanctions and also a neutral Ukraine, permanently outside NATO and without a single Western soldier or piece of military equipment on its territory. It wants a scaled-back Ukrainian army with clear limits on its military capabilities, and it wants official status for the Russian language. In short, Moscow wants a weak, disarmed, isolated Ukraine with as much territory as possible. Ukraine, as you can imagine, wants exactly the opposite. But there's one demand that takes precedence over all others: security guarantees. And pay close attention because this is key to everything. A simple ceasefire isn't enough for the Ukrainians. Why? Because they've been burned once before. In 1994, they handed over their nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees, and those guarantees were absolutely useless when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, nor were they of any use in 2022 when the invasion began. So this time, they want everything ironclad and without having to depend on anyone. They therefore want a powerful military, an open door to the European Union, and for the reconstruction to be paid for by Russian funds frozen in the West. And clearly one thing they have no intention of doing under any circumstances is to legally recognize that the occupied territory has become part of their neighbor's territory. Do you see the clash? Russia wants a weak Ukraine at its mercy. Kyiv, on the other hand, wants a strong and protected Ukraine. 2 opposing visions of the same country. Nevertheless, just because these views clash doesn't mean negotiation is impossible. In fact, on some issues, both sides could make concessions. Ukraine could accept that, for now, it will neither join NATO nor regain by force everything it has lost. And Russia, in return, could accept that Ukraine retains its army or moves closer to Europe. There, with time and pressure, there could be common ground. The problem is that the issues that truly matter do not allow for a middle ground, because in those areas, what one side demands and what the other demands are not just different, they are exact opposites. And nothing illustrates this better than the Donbass region. Let me give you some context. The Donbass consists of these two regions in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. As of today, Russia already controls almost all of Luhansk, but it has yet to conquer a significant portion of Donetsk, and it is precisely there, in that part it has not yet taken, that one of the major sticking points of the entire negotiation lies. Why? Because that piece of land is a huge problem for both sides. For Russia, it's a crucial issue. Remember that Putin justified the entire invasion with a single word: liberating the Donbass. That was the main objective, and it's no coincidence that throughout the war, Russia has concentrated the bulk of its military effort here. Its major battles, those at Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Pokrovsk, have all been aimed at breaking through into Donetsk. So if the war ends, and it turns out that Russia hasn't even managed to hold on to the entire Donbass, the failure would be impossible to hide. And we're not the ones saying this, the Kremlin itself is letting it show. Because not even in that PowerPoint presentation, designed to spin defeat as a victory, were they able to accept the idea that this territory would remain in Ukrainian hands. But for Ukraine, that very same piece of land is even more important, because for them, it's not just territory, it's survival. And the fact is that the part of Donetsk that Russia does not yet control is, precisely, the country's great defensive wall. In other words, an essential component of those security guarantees that matter so much to them. You see, that strip of Donetsk that Russia has yet to conquer has its own name. Analysts call it the Fortified Belt, and it is, without exaggeration, the backbone of the entire Ukrainian defense in the east. This is a strip about 50 kilometers long that runs along the front from north to south, following the H20 highway and connecting these four major cities that you see on the screen. Including the surrounding towns, more than 380,000 people lived here before the war, and the Ukrainians have been fortifying it for more than 11 years. Since 2014, they've been digging kilometers and kilometers of trenches, excavating anti-tank ditches, planting rows of dragon's teeth, laying barbed wire, and laying minefields. And this is just the beginning. Because on top of that, the terrain throughout this entire area has a number of characteristics that make it nearly perfect for defense and a veritable hell for attackers. Let's start with the most obvious: the cities.
The city puts everything in the defender's favor. The attacker has to advance in the open, through wide streets. While the defender fires at him from hidden positions in windows, basements, and rooftops, he's waiting for him and watching his every move. Every building is a small fortress, every corner an ambush. And in the end, it all comes down to small groups of infantry taking one building after another, meter by meter, bleeding for every advance.
Slow, brutal, and extremely costly. This has been very evident in this war. Do you remember Bakhmut? It took Russia 9 months to capture a city of 71,000 people, and Pokrovsk 22 months. Almost 2 years. Well, watch out for this one. The urban area of the fortified belt is more than 4 times larger than that of Bakhmut, and more than 7 times larger than that of Pokrovsk. So do the maths on the time and the number of casualties it would take Russia to capture the entire area. But cities are only part of the picture, because nature itself also works in Ukraine's favor. Take a look. The entire northern flank of the belt is protected by 2 rivers, the Siversky Donets and the Oskil. And what does that mean? Well, to attack from that flank, the Russians would have to cross them, and crossing a defended river is one of the most dreaded operations in any war. In fact, it has been a recurring nightmare for the Russian army. Why? Well, think about it carefully. You can't just cross a river. You need to build a bridge or cross on barges. And that forces you to pile up troops, vehicles, and equipment at a single point on the bank while they wait for their turn to cross. A giant stationary traffic jam in plain sight and within range of enemy artillery and drones. And as if that weren't enough, until the bridge is finished or if it's destroyed, the few soldiers who have already crossed are trapped on the other bank without reinforcements, ammunition, or supplies. In other words, completely at the mercy of the enemy. This isn't just a theory. Russia already lost an entire battalion trying to cross one of these very rivers at the start of the war. And there's yet another factor. Because although eastern Ukraine is fairly flat, the fortified belt rises on slightly higher ground, full of small slopes. And in war, elevation changes everything. The side on high ground can see the enemy coming from afar, has the advantage in firing, and can defend itself so much better, while the attacking side has to advance in the open and uphill. This is also crucial these days in drone warfare, which relies on antennas located at high points to maintain signal strength. And here's what's truly decisive, because all these advantages end right where the belt ends. Cross it to the west, toward the south of the Kharkiv region, and suddenly there's nothing left of this. The city's end. And what remains is open, unpopulated countryside, dotted with farming villages too small to serve as strongholds. Take a look at the data. Within a 100-kilometer radius, there are barely 18 medium-sized Ukrainian towns, and the largest of them all, Lozova, with 53,000 inhabitants before the war, is located more than 80 kilometers from the belt and is completely isolated, too far from any other city to form a new line of defense with it. The rivers also ran out, meaning natural obstacles disappear, and the elevation drops. The terrain flattens out until it meets the Dnieper Plains, an open steppe across which an army can advance at will. And therein lies the key to everything, because that makes the belt much more than just a region. It makes it Ukraine's last line of defense. Behind it, there is no second line of defense to hold, only open countryside stretching all the way to the heart of the country. So the day the belt falls, it won't just be a region that falls. There is a risk that the gateway to the entire country will fall, and that is precisely why both Russia and Ukraine are so determined to hold on to this area. And that's also why it has become one of the biggest stumbling blocks in the entire negotiation, because it's a massive problem for both countries at the same time. For Ukraine, it's a matter of sheer survival. If it hands over the belt, its great red line, the one that guarantees its security, it becomes nothing more than a piece of paper. What good is a promise that they won't invade you again if you yourself hand over the only wall that protects you? But for Putin, the situation is no less delicate. For two reasons. First, seizing that territory would give him enormous leverage for the future. With the door wide open, he would have Ukraine at his mercy. And the second, even more important reason, is to save face. Remember that Russia justified the entire invasion with a single slogan: liberating the Donbass. In other words, if the war ends, and it turns out that Russia hasn't even managed to hold onto the entire Donbass, the failure would be impossible to gloss over, a devastating symbolic blow. But if it manages to secure that territory, then it could spin it as a victory. Ultimately, this small piece of land sums up the entire conflict, because it brings us back to the big question from the beginning. With all this on the table, is there really any chance this war will end? Well, the honest answer is that we're closer than ever, and at the same time, we're still a long way off. And no, that's not a contradiction. We are closer than ever because, for the first time, all the pieces are starting to move in the same direction. But at the same time, we are still a world away, because the underlying knot remains unresolved. Russia wants a weak and disarmed Ukraine. Ukraine wants guarantees that this will never happen again. And for there to be peace, someone would have to give in on precisely the point where they cannot give in. So the road ahead is still full of potholes. Let's not kid ourselves. But for the first time in a long time, the end might be closer than ever. What is clear is that something has changed forever. The question is no longer whether Russia can win this war. The question now is how and when it will extricate itself from it without it looking like a defeat. What do you think? Do you believe Putin will eventually sit down to negotiate in earnest, or does he still have a long war ahead of him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. Take care. I'll see you in the next one.